The kitchen table was drowning. A sea of stark white envelopes with glaring red letters spelling out final notices and collection warnings covered the worn oak wood. The afternoon Texas sun sliced through the dusty blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the heavy, stagnant air, casting long, cruel shadows over the medical bills that had become a mountain of despair. The smell of cold, bitter coffee lingered in the small room, masking the faint metallic scent of the wheelchair parked at the edge of the table. Sarah stared at the papers, her hands trembling, the silence of the room broken only by the ticking of a cheap wall clock. Months ago, those hands were pulling terrified children from beneath the burning, collapsing beams of a warehouse, the smell of ash and melting plastic searing her lungs. Now they were frail, clutching a foreclosure notice, while doctors told her the shattered pieces of her spine meant she would never feel the earth beneath her boots again. She closed her eyes, letting a single tear fall onto the unpaid hospital bill, feeling like the entire world had forgotten the price she paid to save those lives. 70 miles away, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The NRG Stadium in Houston was a colossal beast of steel and concrete, vibrating with the sheer, deafening energy of 70,000 souls. The air inside was thick, a potent, intoxicating Texas blend of expensive perfume, stale spilled beer, the rich scent of worn leather boots, and the electric anticipation of a crowd waiting for their king. The stage was a massive island of blinding light in the center of the dark, roaring arena. And there he stood, George Strait. He did not need pyrotechnics, smoke machines, or wild, thrashing movements to command the room. He stood center stage, a pillar of quiet, absolute authority. His acoustic guitar was strapped across his chest, and the brim of his starched resistal hat cast a shadow over his calm, observant eyes. He was the voice of the working man, the embodiment of a code of honor that was slowly fading from the modern world. Every strum of his guitar, every deep, resonant note from his throat echoed with the truth of dusty highways, hard days of relentless labor, and the undeniable grace of a Sunday morning. But directly beneath the stage, in the coveted front row of the VIP section, the dirt roads and the calloused hands of the working class were nothing but a distant, irrelevant myth. This was the exclusive domain of the city slickers, corporate executives, oil lobbyists, and high-stakes investment bankers who treated the concert not as a gathering of community, but as a lavish backdrop for closing deals and flaunting wealth. They wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than a ranch hand made in an entire year of breaking horses. Their wrists were heavy with thick gold watches that caught the blinding stage lights, flashing like beacons of arrogance. They were loud, entitled, and completely disconnected from the soul of the music echoing above them. They drank top-shelf liquor, laughed obnoxiously over the quiet ballads, and looked at the crowd behind them with veiled contempt. Right in the middle of this sea of corporate privilege, there was a glaring, beautiful anomaly. Row 1, seat 7. It was a simple folding chair with a red velvet cushion, but it was completely empty. It was the only empty seat in the entire sold-out stadium. Resting perfectly in the center of that velvet cushion was a single, fresh yellow rose. A small, handwritten tag hung delicately from its green stem. It was a quiet monument of profound respect, placed there by the direct, unquestionable orders of George himself. The security guards knew not to touch it. The stagehands knew to walk around it with reverence. It was a sacred space amidst the chaotic noise of the concert, a silent tribute waiting for its rightful owner. Richard did not care about sacred spaces. He was a high-ranking political lobbyist, a man who believed that the world was a giant vending machine and his platinum credit card was the only coin that mattered. He stood in the center of the VIP section, an expensive crystal glass of amber whiskey sweating in his perfectly manicured hand. His face was flushed with expensive alcohol and the chronic impatience of a man accustomed to having his every whim catered to instantly. His entourage was large, loud, and one of his junior partners was currently standing awkwardly, shifting his weight, lacking a seat. Richard's cold eyes darted to the empty chair. He scoffed, the sound a harsh, ugly grate against the beautiful country melody floating down from the stage. He snapped his fingers aggressively at a passing stadium usher, demanding the seat be cleared immediately. The young usher, pale and trembling under the weight of the executive's glare, explained with a shaking voice that the seat was strictly reserved, that the artist himself had demanded it remain untouched for the entire night. Richard laughed. It was a cold, cruel, echoing sound that held no joy. He took a slow, arrogant sip of his whiskey, his eyes scanning the yellow rose with absolute disdain. He muttered loud enough for his friends to hear about pathetic hillbilly sentimentality and wasted real estate. To a man like Richard, everything had a price tag, and a simple flower on a chair was a direct insult to his massive purchasing power. He had paid tens of thousands of dollars for this section. He owned the space, the air, and the right to sit wherever he pleased. The band seamlessly transitioned into a slow, sweeping ballad. The massive crowd swayed in unison, cell phone lights illuminating the dark stadium like a galaxy of stars. But in the front row, a different, darker scene was unfolding. Richard handed his whiskey glass to his partner without looking. He stepped forward, his shiny Italian leather shoes stepping aggressively over the boundary line. He reached down and grabbed the yellow rose. He did not just pick it up, he snatched it with a violent, dismissive jerk. The delicate, vibrant petals crumpled and bruised under his tight, aggressive grip. The young usher gasped, stepping forward to intervene, but a massive, stone-faced bodyguard from Richard's entourage stepped in, blocking the usher's path with a threatening, silent glare. Richard looked at the crushed yellow rose in his fist, let out a breath of mock pity, and threw it onto the floor. The concrete beneath their feet was sticky with spilled drinks and discarded peanut shells. The beautiful, vibrant yellow petals landed directly in a dark puddle of stale beer. But Richard was not finished. With a smirk of absolute, unchecked arrogance, he raised his expensive shoe and kicked the flower hard, sending it skidding violently under the heavy metal barricade, out of sight, out of mind, discarded like common trash. He then grabbed the back of the folding chair, yanked it forcefully into his group circle, and gestured grandly for his junior partner to sit down. The problem, in his mind, was permanently solved. Money and power had prevailed, just as they always did in his cold, calculating world. Up on the stage, the spotlights were blinding, creating a wall of white heat, but George Strait's vision was razor-sharp. He had spent a lifetime reading the subtle changes of the weather on the Texas horizon and analyzing the true intentions of men in crowded, noisy rooms. He saw the commotion in the front row. He saw the terrified usher being physically blocked. And most importantly, he saw the flash of beautiful yellow hit the dirty, beer-soaked concrete. His calloused fingers continued to move flawlessly over the strings of his acoustic guitar, the deep muscle memory of 10,000 live shows carrying him through the complex melody. But his spirit halted abruptly. His eyes, usually warm and welcoming beneath the shadow of his hat, turned instantly to cold, unforgiving steel. The thick vein on the side of his neck began to throb, a silent, dangerous alarm bell of righteous anger. He looked down at the men in the expensive suits, laughing and drinking, completely oblivious to the massive, unbreakable line they had just crossed. They had not just disrespected a simple flower. They had desecrated a profound symbol of survival. They had spat upon the very soul of the working-class hero that George held in the absolute highest regard. The music swelled around him. The massive crowd sang along, their voices a massive, echoing choir of joy. But George was no longer singing for them. His voice grew slightly deeper, a heavy, gravelly edge creeping into his smooth baritone. He was staring directly at Richard now. The wealthy lobbyist, suddenly feeling the intense, suffocating weight of the legend's gaze, looked up from his conversation. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant smirk on his flushed face faltered. The air between the massive stage and the front row seemed to crackle with dangerous static electricity, feeling exactly like the heavy, suffocating pressure right before a massive, destructive Texas thunderstorm breaks open the sky. George strummed the guitar for 3 more measures, his eyes locked onto the man who had just insulted a miracle. The pedal steel guitar wept a beautiful, mournful melody that washed over the sea of 70,000 people, a sound as expansive and lonesome as a West Texas highway at twilight. The fiddle player, a veteran of the road who had stood to the left of the country legend for over 2 decades, closed his eyes, losing himself in the rhythm. But as the chorus approached, the veteran musician opened his eyes and felt a sudden, visceral chill crawl up his spine. He looked at George. Something was fundamentally, dangerously wrong. The rhythm was steady, The chords were flawless, but the man at the center of the blinding white spotlights had turned into a statue of cold, unyielding granite. The warmth that usually radiated from the singer, the gentle, knowing smile that made every fan in the colossal stadium feel like they were sitting on a front porch with an old friend, had completely vanished. In its place was a terrifying, quiet fury. George Strait did not miss a beat, his calloused fingers gliding over the heavy gauge strings of his acoustic guitar with the practiced ease of a master craftsman, but his mind was no longer in the song. His deep, observant eyes were locked onto the sticky, beer-soaked concrete floor of the VIP section. Down there, beneath the heavy metal barricades, a symbol of profound human suffering and miraculous resilience had been casually discarded like a piece of worthless garbage. The yellow rose, its delicate petals bruised and crushed by the expensive Italian leather shoe of a man who knew the price of everything and the value of absolutely nothing, lay in the dark. Beside it, the empty folding chair with its red velvet cushion had been violently dragged away, occupied now by a laughing, red-faced junior executive clutching a glass of premium whiskey. The disconnect was entirely unbearable. Above, a choir of tens of thousands of hard-working men and women sang about heartbreak, faith, and the simple, honest truths of a life lived close to the dirt. Below, in the front row, a group of wealthy, entitled men mocked those very same values, insulated by their massive bank accounts and their unshakable belief that the rules of basic human decency simply did not apply to them. George felt a heavy, righteous indignation swell in his chest. He thought about the endless miles of dusty roads he had traveled, the countless hands he had shaken, the stories of quiet, desperate struggle he had heard from people who scraped by week after week, holding on to their faith when their bank accounts were empty. He thought about the woman that empty chair belonged to, a woman whose sheer, unbreakable willpower was a testament to the grace of God. And then he looked at Richard, the arrogant lobbyist who was currently leaning back, laughing loudly at a joke, utterly oblivious to the storm that was about to break over his head. George took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs with the heavy, electrified air of the stadium. He made his decision. The code of the cowboy, the unspoken law of the ranch that dictated you never look away when a wrong is being committed, demanded action. It did not matter that this was the most lucrative, highly anticipated concert of the entire year. It did not matter that there were corporate sponsors watching from the luxury suites, or that the television cameras were broadcasting the event to millions. Right and wrong were not negotiable commodities. George raised his left hand high into the air, his fingers spread wide, cutting through the blinding beam of the main spotlight. The reaction from the band was instantaneous and absolute. Decades of playing together, of reading each other's microscopic body language, meant that they did not need a verbal command. The drummer froze, his stick hovering an inch above the snare. The bass player clamped his hand over his thick strings, killing the vibration instantly. The pedal steel whined into silence. The music did not fade out, it was decapitated. It died so abruptly that the sudden absence of sound felt like a physical blow to the chest. 70,000 voices, caught in the middle of a soaring chorus, faltered and broke. A massive, confused wave of murmurs washed over the colossal concrete bowl of the stadium. People lowered their cell phones, looking around in bewilderment. The massive video screens flanking the stage, which had been showing a close-up of George's face, suddenly captured a man whose expression was as dark and dangerous as a thunderhead rolling over the plains. The silence that fell over the Houston arena was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly tense, smelling faintly of ozone and spilled beer, the exact kind of dead, breathless quiet that falls over the prairie right before a tornado touches down and tears the earth apart. George reached down to the bottom of his acoustic guitar. His hand grasped the thick black instrument cable plugged into the jack. With a slow, deliberate, and forceful motion, he yanked it out. The sound of the heavy metal plug disconnecting from the live amplification system echoed through the stadium speakers like a massive, echoing gunshot. The sharp, violent crack made tens of thousands of people physically jump in their seats. The tension in the air spiked to an unbearable level. George let the black cable fall to the wooden stage floor. He let his guitar hang loose on its leather strap. He stepped out from behind the microphone stand, leaving the safety of the center stage, and began to walk. His movements were not rushed. He did not storm forward in a blind rage. He walked with the slow, measured, heavy steps of a man who carried the weight of absolute authority. The sound of his leather Lucchese boots striking the hollow wooden planks of the stage echoed in the massive, silent arena. Thud, thud, thud. The spotlight operators, completely panicked and confused, scrambled to follow him, casting a harsh, blinding circle of white light around his tall, stoic frame as he moved toward the very edge of the stage. Down in the VIP section, the laughter abruptly died. Richard, the wealthy lobbyist, stopped with his crystal glass of whiskey halfway to his mouth. The sudden, unnatural silence of the stadium had finally penetrated his bubble of arrogance. He looked up, his eyes squinting against the blinding glare of the spotlights, and realized with a sudden, icy jolt of sheer terror that the king of country music was standing directly above him. George was looking down at him, not as a performer looking at a fan, but as a judge looking at a convicted man. George crouched down slowly, resting his forearm on his knee, bringing his face closer to the edge of the stage. The sheer magnetic presence of the man was overwhelming. Richard felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine, ruining the collar of his custom-tailored silk shirt. The people in the rows behind the VIP section, sensing the confrontation, began to stand up, leaning forward, holding their breath. The silence was so profound that you could hear the faint hum of the massive stadium generators. A stagehand, trembling with adrenaline, rushed forward from the shadows of the wings and handed George a wireless microphone. George took it without looking away from Richard. He brought the metal mesh to his lips. When he spoke, his voice was not angry. It was far worse than angry. It was calm, polite, and completely devoid of mercy. It was the voice of a southern gentleman who had found a rattlesnake in his living room. "Sir," George said, his deep, resonant baritone echoing off the concrete walls of the massive stadium, rolling over the 70,000 silent fans like a shockwave. "I am going to need you to stand up." Richard swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as dust. He tried to muster the arrogant bravado that usually served him so well in corporate boardrooms and political backchannels. He plastered a fake, trembling smile on his face, trying to play to the crowd, trying to make it seem like this was all part of the show. "Hey now, George," Richard stammered, his voice loud and grating, trying to project confidence but failing miserably. "We're just having a good time down here. I paid $30,000 for this block of seats. I think my associate here has the right to sit down and enjoy the music." The crowd behind them gasped collectively. A low, dangerous rumble of disapproval began to ripple through the lower bowl of the stadium. The working men and women who had saved up for months just to buy a ticket in the nosebleed section stared down at the man in the expensive suit with pure, unadulterated disgust. George did not blink. He did not raise his voice. He simply leaned an inch closer, his eyes boring into Richard's soul, stripping away the expensive suit, the gold watch, and the corporate title, leaving nothing but a small, frightened man. "I do not care if you bought the entire stadium, son," George said, the gravel in his voice scraping against the microphone. "That chair does not belong to you, and that flower you just kicked into the dirt is worth more than every dollar in your bank account." The rumble in the crowd grew louder, transforming into a wave of vocal hostility. Boos began to rain down from the upper decks, echoing like thunder. Richard looked around, his fake smile collapsing completely. He was surrounded by a sea of angry faces. His entourage, the men who usually laughed at his cruel jokes and protected him from the consequences of his actions, were suddenly looking at the ground, desperately trying to distance themselves from him. He was entirely alone, trapped in the blinding spotlight, facing the quiet, devastating wrath of a Texas legend. "Now," George continued, his voice cutting through the rising noise of the crowd, silencing them instantly. "I am going to ask you one more time, and I am only going to ask you once. You are going to stand up. You are going to tell your friend to get out of that chair. You are going to get down on your knees. You're going to reach under that barricade, and you're going to pick up that yellow rose. And then you are going to place it right back exactly where you found it." It was not a request. It was an absolute, unbreakable command. The psychological pressure in the stadium was crushing. Richard looked at the cold, hard faces of the security guards who were now slowly closing in around his section. He looked at the massive crowd, realizing that if he refused, there might be a riot, and no amount of corporate lawyers could save him from the fury of 70,000 Texans. His hands began to shake violently. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the concrete, the expensive amber whiskey mixing with the stale beer and peanut shells. Richard, a man who prided himself on never bending the knee to anyone, slowly, humiliatingly stood up. He gestured weakly for his junior partner to vacate the folding chair. The younger man practically jumped out of the seat, his face pale with terror. The entire stadium watched in absolute, breathless silence as the wealthy, powerful lobbyist sank to his knees. The knees of his $2,000 Italian suit soaked up the sticky, foul-smelling liquid on the stadium floor. He humbled himself, crawling slightly forward, reaching his manicured hand under the heavy, dirty metal barricade. His fingers brushed against the crushed, bruised petals of the yellow rose. He pulled it out, his face burning with a shame so profound it felt like a physical fire under his skin. He stood up, his hands trembling violently, and gently, carefully, placed the ruined flower back onto the center of the red velvet cushion. He did not look at George. He did not look at the crowd. He simply backed away, shrinking into the shadows of his group, completely and utterly broken. George watched him for a long moment, ensuring the task was done. Then he stood up straight. He turned his back on the VIP section, dismissing them entirely, and walked slowly back to the center of the massive stage. The spotlight followed him, casting a long, heroic shadow across the wooden boards. He did not pick up his guitar. He kept the microphone in his hand and looked out over the massive, sprawling ocean of faces in the stadium. The silence was still absolute, waiting for him to explain the monumental event they had just witnessed. George took a deep breath, looking down at the empty chair and the bruised yellow rose. When he spoke again, the dangerous edge was gone from his voice. It was replaced by a deep, profound sorrow, and a well of emotion so deep it made the hardest cowboys in the audience swallow hard. "There is a sickness in this world," George began, his voice echoing softly, filling the massive space with a quiet, undeniable truth. "A sickness that makes a man believe that the size of his wallet dictates the size of his worth. That makes people think they can buy respect, buy honor, and trample over anything that gets in their way. But out here, where the dirt meets the sky, we know different. We know that true wealth is not measured by what you can buy, but by what you are willing to give away." He paused, letting the words sink into the hearts of the 70,000 people listening. The massive video screens showed a close-up of his face, revealing the deep lines of wisdom around his eyes, and the genuine, raw emotion reflecting in them. "That chair down there," George said, pointing a calloused finger toward the front row. "That chair does not belong to a corporate sponsor. It does not belong to a politician. That chair belongs to a woman named Sarah." He spoke her name with a reverence usually reserved for Sunday mornings in a small wooden church. "Sarah is a paramedic right here in Houston," George continued, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a storyteller sharing a sacred legend. "She is a single mother. She works double shifts to keep food on the table, to keep the lights on, to make sure her little girl has a fighting chance in this hard world. She is the kind of person who runs into the dark when everyone else is running away. She is the backbone of this country. She is the reason we can sleep safely in our beds." The crowd was completely spellbound. People in the upper decks were leaning forward, tears already beginning to well in their eyes, captivated by the raw, unvarnished truth of the story. "8 months ago," George said, the pain evident in his voice, "the alarm rang at her station. A massive warehouse fire on the east side of town. The roof was collapsing. The smoke was so thick it blocked out the Texas sun. When Sarah and her team arrived, they found out there were 2 little kids trapped inside, hiding in a back office, terrified and choking on the ash." George closed his eyes for a brief second, the image of the inferno playing in his mind, the smell of burning plastic and melting steel almost tangible in the air. "Sarah did not wait for backup," he said, his voice rising slightly, filled with profound admiration. "She did not think about her paycheck. She did not think about the danger. She kicked that door down and walked into the fire. She found those kids. She wrapped them in her own protective coat. But as she was carrying them out, the main support beam of that warehouse gave way. A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the massive stadium. Down in the front row, Richard stared at the floor, the weight of his own monstrous behavior crushing him into the dirt. That burning beam came down, George said, his voice dropping to a heavy, heartbreaking whisper. It missed the kids, but it caught Sarah right across the back. It shattered her spine. It pinned her to the burning floor. Her partner had to drag her out of the flames while the building collapsed behind them. She saved those babies, but the doctors at the hospital, they looked at her charts, they looked at the broken pieces of her back, and they told her a terrible truth. They told her she would never ever walk again. The silence in the stadium was no longer tense. It was a devastating, heartbroken quiet. Grown men in worn denim jackets wiped tears from their weathered faces. Women clutched their hands to their chests. The story of immense sacrifice and unimaginable loss hung in the heavy stadium air, a stark, glaring contrast to the superficial arrogance that had just been displayed in the front row. "I heard about Sarah," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "I went to visit her in that hospital room. I saw the mountain of medical bills piled up on her little table, threatening to take everything she had left. I saw the wheelchair sitting in the corner, a cold metal cage waiting to claim her life. But when I looked into her eyes, I did not see a victim. I did not see defeat. I saw the unbreakable, unyielding spirit of a Texas woman who refused to let the fire win." He pointed down at the yellow rose, its bruised petals resting on the red velvet. "I bought that seat for her tonight," George declared, his voice ringing with absolute pride. "I told her that whenever she was ready, whenever she wanted to hear some music, the best seat in the house would be waiting for her, marked with a yellow rose, a symbol of survival, of faith, and of the grace of the good Lord above. I told the security guards to keep it empty, because I knew deep down in my soul that Sarah was not going to let a wheelchair define her story." George took a step forward, his eyes blazing with a fierce, triumphant light. He looked directly into the lens of the main television camera, ensuring his next words would be broadcast to the entire world. "Those doctors told her she would never take another step," George said, his voice rising, building toward a monumental crescendo. "They looked at the science, they looked at the X-rays, and they said it was impossible. But let me tell you something about impossible. Money can buy a lot of things in this world. It can buy expensive suits, it can buy front-row tickets, it can buy politicians and power. But money cannot buy the fiber of a hard-working spirit. Money cannot buy the will of a mother fighting for her life. And money, ladies and gentlemen, cannot buy a miracle." George Strait slowly raised his right arm and pointed his calloused finger all the way across the massive stadium, directing the attention of 70,000 people toward the dark, cavernous tunnel of the main entrance at the far end of the arena. "Because sometimes," George said, his voice trembling with sheer overwhelming awe, "miracles decide to walk right through the front door." The massive video screens flanking the stage abruptly cut away from George's face. The feed switched to a live camera positioned deep inside the main entrance tunnel. The stadium held its breath as a figure emerged from the shadows into the harsh, glaring stadium light. The image on the colossal screens was raw, unfiltered, and completely breathtaking. The camera operator, his hands steady despite the immense emotional weight of the moment, focused tightly on a pair of silver, heavy-duty medical crutches. They were moving forward, striking the hard concrete floor of the stadium tunnel with a slow, agonizing but fiercely determined rhythm. Clack, thud, clack, thud. The sound, amplified slightly by the tunnel's acoustics, echoed through the massive arena, cutting through the heavy, expectant silence like a heartbeat. The camera slowly panned up, revealing a woman whose face was etched with the undeniable maps of profound physical pain and a sheer terrifying willpower that defied logic and medical science. It was Sarah. She was wearing simple blue jeans, a faded t-shirt, and a pair of worn leather boots that had not touched the earth in 8 agonizing months. Her knuckles were white, gripping the handles of the crutches with a desperate white knuckle intensity. Beside her, his arm hovering inches from her waist, ready to catch her if she fell, was an older man with a weathered face and a salt and pepper mustache, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He was her father, a retired steelworker who had watched his daughter's life shatter and was now witnessing her miraculous resurrection. The reason for the empty chair became instantly, devastatingly clear to every single soul in the stadium. The delay was not a matter of a fan running late or getting stuck in Houston traffic. The delay was because Sarah, the paramedic who had broken her spine, saving 2 children from a roaring inferno, had absolutely refused the offer of a stadium golf cart. She had refused to be wheeled down the ramp in the metal chair that had become her prison. She had insisted, against the advice of her physical therapists and the desperate pleas of her father, to walk from the handicap parking lot, through the massive concourse, and all the way down to the very first row of the VIP section on her own 2 feet. The stadium erupted. It was not a cheer, it was a seismic event. 70,000 people rose to their feet simultaneously, a massive tidal wave of humanity roaring with a sound that shook the steel girders of the roof. It was a primal, thunderous explosion of pure, unadulterated catharsis. The noise was deafening, a beautiful, chaotic symphony of cowboys whistling, women screaming with joy, and grown men sobbing openly, their faces buried in their hands. The collective emotion in the building was so thick, so heavy with grace and redemption, that it felt like a physical weight pressing against the chest. Down in the front row, the contrast was absolute and horrifying for the men who had just desecrated the symbol of this miracle. Richard, the arrogant lobbyist, stood completely frozen, his expensive suit feeling like a straitjacket, his face drained of all color. He stared at the massive screens, watching the agonizing, beautiful struggle of the woman whose seat he had stolen, whose flower he had kicked into the dirt. The sheer magnitude of his own pettiness, his own monstrous entitlement, crashed down upon him like a physical blow. He looked around, desperately seeking an escape, but he was surrounded by a wall of furious, disgusted faces. The fans in the rows behind him, who had watched his arrogant display, were now glaring at him with a silent, terrifying promise of violence if he dared to speak a single word. The stadium security guards, big men with thick necks and walkie-talkies, moved in silently. They did not ask Richard to leave. They simply formed a tight, impenetrable circle around him and his shrinking entourage. With rough, unyielding hands, they grabbed the lapels of his $2,000 jacket and physically escorted him out of the VIP section. The wealthy executive, who had believed his money made him invincible, was marched out of the stadium in complete, humiliating silence, swallowed whole by his own shame, a pathetic footnote in a story of absolute triumph. He would never be seen in a VIP section in Houston again. Up on the stage, George Strait stood tall, the microphone resting against his chest. He watched the massive screens, his own eyes shining with a rare, profound moisture. He did not say a word. He let the moment breathe, letting the monumental roar of the crowd wash over the stadium, a testament to the power of the human spirit. The band behind him, veterans of 1,000 shows, stood completely still, their instruments silent, paying their own silent tribute to the woman walking down the aisle. The journey from the tunnel to the front row was agonizingly slow. Every single step Sarah took was a battle against gravity, against the shattered nerves in her back, against the memory of the burning beam that had tried to end her life. Her face was pale, glistening with sweat under the harsh stadium lights, her jaw set in a hard, unbreakable line. But as she reached the bottom of the ramp, as she stepped onto the floor of the arena, the crowd surrounding the aisle parted like the Red Sea. They did not crowd her. They did not try to touch her. They simply stood back, hands over their hearts, whispering prayers and words of encouragement, creating a sacred path for her to walk. She reached the front row. The empty folding chair, its red velvet cushion waiting patiently, was right in front of her. Resting perfectly in the center, slightly bruised but still vibrant and beautiful, was the yellow rose. Sarah stopped. She leaned heavily on her crutches, her chest heaving, her breath coming in ragged, exhausting gasps. She looked at the chair, and then, slowly, she raised her head and looked up at the massive stage. George Strait was already moving. He handed the microphone back to the trembling stagehand. He walked to the very edge of the stage, right above the VIP section. He did not smile. He simply looked at the woman who had defied the impossible. With a slow, deliberate motion, George reached up and grasped the brim of his starched resistal hat. He pulled it from his head, holding it against his chest, bowing his head in a gesture of profound, absolute respect. It was the ultimate salute from a Texas legend, a silent acknowledgement that the true hero of the night was not the man on the stage with the platinum records, but the woman standing in the dirt with the silver crutches. Sarah's tough, unbreakable facade finally cracked. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a clean line down her sweaty cheek. She looked down at the folding chair. With a tremendous, shuddering effort, she lowered herself onto the red velvet cushion. The moment her weight settled into the seat, a collective sigh of relief washed over the massive stadium. She reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the bruised yellow rose. She brought the delicate petals to her face, closing her eyes, inhaling the sweet, faint fragrance of survival. George put his hat back on his head. He turned around, walked back to the center microphone, and picked up his acoustic guitar. He plugged the heavy black cable back into the jack. The loud, satisfying click echoed through the stadium, a signal that the storm had passed, that justice had been served, and that the world was right again. He looked out over the sea of 70,000 faces, his eyes locking onto the front row, right onto the woman holding the yellow rose. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said, his voice smooth, warm, and filled with a deep, abiding joy, "I believe we have a song to finish, and this one goes out to the strongest woman in the state of Texas." He strummed a single beautiful chord on his guitar. The band, instantly reanimated, fell perfectly into rhythm behind him. The music swelled, filling the massive concrete bowl with a sound so rich, so full of life and redemption, that it felt like a physical embrace. The crowd roared again, singing along with a renewed, desperate passion, their voices blending with the legend on stage, creating a massive, beautiful choir of the working class. Down in the front row, the empty chair was no longer empty. Sarah sat tall, the yellow rose resting gently in her lap, her father standing proudly by her side. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, the deep, resonant voice of George Strait, singing about faith, about hard times, and about the beautiful, undeniable truth that no matter how dark the night gets, the sun always rises over the Texas plains. The bruised petals of the flower in her hands were a stark reminder of the ugliness of the world. But the fact that she was sitting there, breathing the heavy stadium air, feeling the vibration of the bass drum in her chest, was proof that miracles, born of blood, sweat, and unyielding faith, were real. The concert continued, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a show, it was a massive communal celebration of resilience. The image of the king of country music stopping his show, humiliating a corporate giant, and bowing his head to a paralyzed paramedic holding a crushed yellow rose, became an instant, unbreakable legend. It was a story that would be told in dusty honky-tonks, around crackling campfires, and in quiet hospital rooms for generations to come. It was a stark, beautiful reminder that true greatness does not reside in the balance of a bank account, the cut of an expensive suit, or the power to buy the front row. True greatness is found in the dirt, in the struggle, in the quiet, desperate moments, when a person decides to stand up against all odds and walk into the fire. And in a world increasingly dominated by the cold, calculating arrogance of the city slickers, the decency, the honor, and the miraculous, unbreakable spirit of the working class will always, undeniably, hold the very best seat in the house.